Have you ever felt so broken that you just wanted to disappear? Imagine discovering the person you built your entire life with has been living a lie. One moment, you have a perfect home, a successful husband, and a future you believe in. The next, it all shatters into a million pieces, leaving you with nothing but shame and a suitcase full of broken dreams. This is the story of a woman who was erased, cast aside for a younger, more ambitious replacement. But what happens when the woman everyone forgot refuses to stay forgotten? This is what happens when she doesn't just get back on her feet. She returns to build an empire on the ashes of her old life, ready to face the man who destroyed her, not as a victim, but as his new reality. Stay tuned. The betrayal didn't announce itself with a scream. It was a whisper, a thin paper cut of a discovery in the sterile perfection of their Greenwich, Connecticut home. Amelia Hayes had always prided herself on managing the intricate details of her husband David Miller's life. She orchestrated his world so he could conquer it. But for the past 6 months, a detail had been nagging at her: the American Express statements. They were for a corporate card, one she didn't usually scrutinize, but the charges were odd. A recurring consultant fee, always a neat 5 figures, paid out to Advance Creative Solutions. Then the peripherals, dinners at per se that David claimed were solo business trips, suites at the Baccarat Hotel for investor meetings, and a particularly glaring charge from Cartier on their anniversary, a day David had forgotten until she'd reminded him with a painfully cheerful breakfast in bed. He'd presented her with flowers from the gas station later that evening, his apology smelling of expensive whiskey and a faint, unfamiliar perfume. That night, the paper cut deepened. David was asleep, a soft snore rumbling in his chest. His phone lay on the nightstand. Amelia, whose heart was thumping a rhythm of pure dread, had never violated his privacy before. It felt like stepping off a cliff. But she was already falling. His password was their son's birthday, a detail so sentimental it felt like a fresh betrayal. The texts were under the name Chloe Vance. Her profile picture showed a sharp, impossibly beautiful woman with ambitious eyes, probably 10 years younger than Amelia. The messages were a script of their secret life, written in the language of stolen moments and shared futures. "Can't wait to get you out of that museum and into our new life," Chloe had texted 2 days ago. "This deal closes, and we're free." "Soon," David had replied. "Just have to handle the exit strategy with Mia. She's fragile." Fragile. The word detonated in the silent room. Amelia looked at her hands. They were trembling. These were the hands that had typed his business school application, that had held his head after his father's funeral, that had rubbed his back every single night for 15 years. Fragile? No. They had made him strong. She walked through their home, a monument to their shared success, and saw it for what it was, a beautifully designed cage. Every piece of furniture she'd chosen, every swatch of paint, felt like a prop in a play where she was the unwitting fool. He hadn't just cheated, he had built a parallel life on the foundation she had laid for him, using her trust as mortar. The confrontation happened the next morning over coffee. The air was thick with unspoken words. She slid the printed bank statements across the marble island. "Vance Creative Solutions," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. "Is her creative solution finding new ways to spend my husband's money?" David's face, usually a mask of charming confidence, went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, denial, then a flicker of anger at being caught. He tried to bluff. "Mia, that's a corporate expense, a new marketing consultant." "Does your marketing consultant require a Panthère de Cartier watch to brainstorm taglines?" Amelia's voice was low, lethal. She pushed his phone across the island, Chloe's texts open on the screen. "Or does she help with your exit strategy?" The charm evaporated, replaced by a cold, transactional hardness she'd only ever seen him use on business rivals. "Look, Mia, I didn't want you to find out this way." "This way?" she laughed, a sound that broke in the middle. As opposed to what? A memo? A formal press release announcing my redundancy? Don't be dramatic, he snapped, his guilt twisting into aggression. It's not like you didn't see this coming. We've been growing apart for years. You've let yourself go. You used to have ambition, a spark. Now all you do is manage the house. Every word was a hammer blow, expertly aimed at her deepest insecurities. She had given up her promising architectural career to support his. It had been a joint decision, a sacrifice for the family, for his focus. He had called it their partnership. Now he was calling it her failure. I supported you, she whispered, the words feeling useless. I built this life with you. And you were compensated for it, he said, his voice as cold as the marble countertop. A beautiful home, a comfortable life. Chloe understands my world now. She's part of it. You're not. The power imbalance was staggering. He held all the cards, the money, the career, the narrative. He had already written her out of their story. She was just the final detail to be managed, his fragile exit strategy. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and the man she had loved for half her life was gone. In his place was a stranger, a ruthless CEO dissolving a failed asset. Fine, she said, the single word hanging in the air. She walked upstairs, her movements stiff, robotic. She packed a single suitcase, not with the designer clothes David had bought her, but with the simple things she'd owned before him. Old jeans, a worn sketchbook, a handful of books. She took her personal savings, a modest amount she'd kept from a small inheritance, and her car keys. As she walked out the door, he was already on the phone, his voice hushed. It's done, he was saying. It was messy, but it's done. Amelia didn't look back. She drove until the sun came up, the tears finally coming, hot and silent. She wasn't just leaving a marriage. She was disappearing from a life where she had become invisible long before she walked out the door. She was fragile, yes, but even the most fragile things can be reforged in fire. The first few weeks were a study in erasure. Amelia drove north with no destination other than away. She ended up in a small, forgotten town in Vermont, renting a tiny, drafty cabin on the edge of a silent lake. The opulent life in Greenwich felt like a dream she'd woken from. Here, the only sounds were the wind in the pines and the frantic, desperate drumbeat of her own thoughts. She was 42 years old, with a 15-year gap in her resume and a heart shattered into dust. David's words echoed in the silence. You let yourself go. You have no ambition. He had assessed her worth and found it wanting. The shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She'd call her mother, who would offer platitudes like, he'll come to his senses, and men are just fools, which were as comforting as placing a bandage on a gaping wound. Her friends, mostly wives of David's colleagues, offered sympathy laced with a palpable fear that this could happen to them too. Their calls soon dwindled. She was a ghost at their brunch tables, a cautionary tale. She was officially, completely alone. It was in that crushing solitude that she opened the old sketchbook she'd packed. The pages were filled with designs from her university days, bold, innovative concepts for sustainable, modular architecture. They were ideas that had excited her, that had won her awards, that she had put in a box to collect dust when David's career took off. Flipping through the brittle pages, she felt a flicker of a person she barely recognized, a woman who was passionate, intelligent, and fiercely creative. The woman before David. The woman he had accused of having no spark. He hadn't extinguished it. He'd just convinced her to hide it under a bushel of domesticity. For days, she did nothing but draw. She filled the sketchbook, then bought new ones. She drew on napkins, on receipts, on the back of junk mail. She designed eco-friendly homes that could be built with minimal waste, community spaces that integrated nature, and urban structures that generated their own power. The act of creation was the only thing that quieted the screaming in her head. It was a form of therapy, of reclaiming the part of herself she had sacrificed. One bleak afternoon, staring at a complex design for a software platform that could streamline the entire architectural planning and material sourcing process for sustainable builds, she realized it was more than a drawing. It was a billion-dollar idea. But an idea was just vapor without capital and technical expertise. On a desperate whim, she called the one person from her past who had never been part of David's world, Ben Carter. He had been her closest friend in architecture school, a brilliant, quirky genius who had veered into tech and was now a respected but under-the-radar software developer in San Francisco. They hadn't spoken in years, a casualty of her all-consuming marriage. He answered on the second ring. "Mia, is that really you?" She broke down, the whole sordid story pouring out of her in a torrent of grief and humiliation. Ben listened patiently, without judgment. When she was finished, hiccuping apologies for the incoherent rambling, he was silent for a long moment. "He said you had no ambition," Ben finally said, his voice tight with anger. "That man wouldn't know ambition if it bit him on his over-leveraged ass. Mia, you were the most talented person in our program. You made the rest of us look like we were building with Legos." His belief in her was a shock to her system, a jolt of electricity to a heart she thought had stopped. Hesitantly, she told him about her ideas, about the software platform she'd been designing. She expected him to humor her, to tell her it was a nice hobby. Instead, he grew excited. "Mia, this is revolutionary," he said, after she'd emailed him a few scans from her sketchbook. "This doesn't just streamline the process, it gamifies sustainable sourcing. It could completely disrupt the construction industry. You're talking about saving developers millions and making green building the most profitable option. It's brilliant." "It's just an idea in a book," she said, her voice small. "No," he insisted. "It's a blueprint, and I know how to build it. I've got some seed money saved up from my last buyout. It's not much, but it's enough to build a prototype. I'm willing to bet it all on you." Amelia was stunned into silence. Someone saw her. Not the discarded wife, not the fragile woman, but the architect, the innovator. "Why would you do that, Ben?" "Because I always knew you were meant to build empires, Mia," he said softly. "Not just manage someone else's house." That conversation was the turning point. Amelia Hayes, the wife, died in that Vermont cabin. In her place, a new woman began to emerge. She legally changed her name back to her maiden name, Amelia Sterling. It felt like shedding a skin. She and Ben worked relentlessly, communicating through video calls at all hours. He handled the coding and the back-end architecture. She refined the user interface, built the business model, and started networking with her old contacts in the sustainable materials industry. For 5 years, she remained a ghost. She poured every ounce of her pain, anger, and grief into her work. It became her obsession. She learned about venture capital, about corporate law, about scaling a tech company. The woman who David thought was fragile was negotiating multi-million-dollar funding rounds with Silicon Valley's most ruthless VCs. They called their company Aura for the energy-positive footprint their designs enabled. It grew slowly at first, then with explosive force. Their software became the gold standard for environmentally conscious construction, adopted by firms across Europe and Asia before it even made a significant splash in the US. Amelia Sterling was no longer hiding. She was quietly, methodically building an arsenal. She never checked David's social media. She never asked mutual acquaintances about him. He and the life they'd shared had become irrelevant. Her ambition now was not about revenge. It was about resurrection. 5 years after Amelia walked out of his life, David Miller was sitting in his glass-walled office overlooking the Manhattan skyline, feeling the familiar, gnawing dissatisfaction that had become the backdrop of his life. His marriage to Chloe was not the victory he had imagined. It was a constant, exhausting performance. Chloe had slipped into the role of the wealthy wife with ferocious dedication, but she lacked Amelia's quiet grace. Her ambition, which had once seemed exciting, now felt grasping. Their conversations revolved around which charity galas to attend, which rivals to snub, and how to get their names mentioned in the right society columns. The thrill of the affair had curdled into the mundane reality of a transaction. He had traded comfortable, unconditional love for a beautiful, high-maintenance accessory. His business, Miller Development, was also facing headwinds. The market was shifting. A new wave of regulations and public demand was pushing for green construction, an area David had always dismissed as boutique nonsense for hippies. His monolithic, energy-guzzling towers were starting to look like dinosaurs. He was in the middle of a bidding war for the landmark Hudson Yards renewal project, a massive undertaking that could either secure his legacy or bankrupt him. He needed this win. "The board is getting nervous about our sustainability pitch," his COO, a perpetually worried man named George, said during their morning meeting. "Our competitors are all using this new software platform, Aura. It's apparently cutting their material costs by 20% and fast-tracking their green certifications. We need to look into it." "Another tech fad," David grumbled, waving a dismissive hand. "Get them on the phone. See what they're peddling." An hour later, George was back, his face pale. "I have their pitch deck. David, you need to see this." He slid a tablet across the polished mahogany desk. The Aura logo was minimalist and elegant. The presentation was slick, showcasing a revolutionary platform that integrated AI-driven design, supply chain logistics, and automated environmental impact reporting. It was brilliant, and David felt a sickening knot of professional jealousy. Then he swiped to the Our Team page. His breath caught in his chest. There were two faces. One was a man he didn't recognize, Benjamin Carter, CTO. The other was a woman who was both a stranger and the most familiar person in the world. Her hair was cut in a sharp, stylish bob, not the long, soft waves she used to wear. She wore a tailored black dress, her posture radiating a power he'd never seen in her. But the eyes, they were the same. Intense, intelligent, and holding a depth that unsettled him. The name beneath the photo was Amelia Sterling. "Sterling," David said aloud, his voice hoarse. That was her maiden name. "Is there a connection?" George asked, oblivious. "No," David said quickly, his mind reeling. "No connection. It couldn't be. The Mia he knew was soft. She organized dinner parties and remembered his clients' birthdays. She couldn't build a tech empire that was threatening to eat his lunch. It was a coincidence. It had to be. But for the rest of the day, he couldn't shake her image. He found a recent keynote speech she'd given at a tech conference in Berlin. He watched it in the privacy of his office, the door locked. The woman on the stage was formidable. She spoke with an eloquence and authority that held the entire auditorium rapt. She was witty, insightful, and utterly in command of her subject. She didn't fidget. She didn't apologize with her body language. This wasn't the woman he had called fragile. This was a titan. He felt a bizarre mix of emotions. Disbelief, rage, and a sliver of something he couldn't name. Was it admiration, or was it fear? He had written her off as a casualty of his success, a footnote in his biography. But here she was, the author of a story that was about to collide with his own. That evening he went home to the sterile, museum-like penthouse he shared with Chloe. She was preening in front of a mirror, fastening a diamond necklace. "We're going to be late for the Guggenheim fundraiser," she said, her tone sharp. "You've been distracted all day. Is it the Hudson Yards bid?" "Something like that," he muttered, loosening his tie. "Don't worry," she said, turning to face him, a predatory gleam in her eye. "We'll get it. We always get what we want. We're Millers." David looked at her, at the diamonds, the perfect makeup, the hollow ambition in her eyes. He thought of the woman in the video, the quiet power she projected. He had told Mia she wasn't part of his world anymore. He was beginning to realize he had been profoundly wrong. She hadn't been cast out of his world. She had simply gone off and built her own, and it was bigger, smarter, and infinitely more powerful than he could have ever imagined. The echo of her name was no longer a whisper from the past. It was the sound of an approaching storm. The news broke on a Tuesday morning, delivered not by a phone call, but by the blaring headline of the Wall Street Journal's digital edition. Aura Technologies stuns real estate world with surprise bid, partners with global firm for Hudson Yards renewal. David stared at the headline on his monitor, the coffee in his hand forgotten. His company, Miller Development, had been the front runner. It was supposed to be his coronation, the project that would make him a legend. Instead, he'd been sideswiped. The article detailed how Aura, a software company, had made an unprecedented leap into development, forming a joint venture with a massive international construction conglomerate. Their bid wasn't just competitive, it was revolutionary. It promised a carbon-neutral development built faster and for a lower cost than any of the traditional bids, all thanks to their proprietary technology. The City Planning Commission was hailing it as the future of urban development. He read the quotes from Aura's CEO, Amelia Sterling. They were crisp, visionary, and devastatingly effective. "This isn't just about building structures," she was quoted as saying. "It's about building a sustainable future. The old way of doing things is no longer profitable or responsible. We're providing a better way." The old way. She was talking about him. He slammed his fist on the desk. "Get George in here, now!" George scurried in, already holding a copy of the press release. "We were completely blindsided, David. They kept it under wraps until the final submission. No one even knew they were in the running." "How?" David raged, pacing his office. "How does a software nerd from nowhere suddenly become a major player in New York real estate? Where did she get the capital? Who is backing her?" The questions were a smokescreen for the one he was really asking. How did Mia do this? The psychological whiplash was severe. He had cast her in the role of the tragic ex-wife, a woman who would likely fade into obscurity, perhaps remarry a quiet dentist, and live a small, suburban life. He had pitied her. This was an act of war. Chloe's reaction was less strategic and more primal. She saw it as a personal attack. "That pathetic woman is trying to ruin us," she shrieked when he told her, her carefully constructed composure cracking. "After all this time, it's revenge. She's doing this to get back at you, at us." "It's not about you, Chloe," David snapped, his patience worn thin. "This is business. She found a weakness in my market and she's exploiting it. It's a brilliant move." The admission left a sour taste in his mouth. He spent the next week in a feverish haze, digging into Aura Technologies. What he found only deepened his shock and gnawing sense of irrelevance. Aura wasn't a startup. It was a global powerhouse, quietly dominating the industry in Europe and Asia for the past 3 years. Amelia Sterling wasn't some scorned woman with a vendetta. She was a respected, globally recognized CEO, a visionary in the sustainable tech space. The financial backers weren't mysterious. They were some of the biggest and most respected venture capital firms in the world. He had been so consumed with his own small kingdom that he had failed to notice a new continent rising just over the horizon. The fallout was immediate. His investors, already jittery, started calling. Their confidence in his leadership was shaken. The Hudson Yards project was more than just a single deal. It was a bellwether for the future of the industry, and he had been on the wrong side of it. The narrative was that David Miller, the titan of New York real estate, had been outmaneuvered, made to look like a relic. He started seeing Amelia's face everywhere, on magazine covers, on financial news networks. Forbes ran a feature titled "The Quiet Architect: How Amelia Sterling is Building Tomorrow's World." The article touched briefly on her past, mentioning she'd left a conventional life behind to pursue her vision. The understatement was almost comical. She hadn't left a conventional life. She had escaped a cage he'd locked her in and had proceeded to build a rocket ship. The power imbalance that had defined their last conversation had not just been leveled. It had been inverted with tectonic force. He was the one who was now vulnerable, his future uncertain. She was the one with the momentum, the capital, and the story everyone wanted to hear. He found himself thinking about their last fight, his cruel, dismissive words. "You let yourself go. You have no ambition." He had meant to crush her, to make her small enough that leaving her wouldn't feel like a loss. He had succeeded for a time, but he had fundamentally misunderstood the woman he had been married to for 15 years. He had mistaken her quiet support for weakness, her sacrifice for a lack of drive. He had thrown away a diamond, thinking it was a simple stone, only to watch it be picked up, cut, and polished into something so brilliant it now cast a shadow over his entire world. The first tremor had passed. Now he could feel the ground beneath his feet beginning to crack. The meeting was unavoidable. The Hudson Yards renewal was a multi-party project, and a preliminary logistics meeting was called between all major stakeholders. Miller Development, as the owner of adjacent properties crucial for infrastructure access, had to be there. And so did Aura Technologies. David prepared for the meeting like a general preparing for battle. He had his team assemble a dossier on Amelia's company, her board, her financials. He rehearsed his talking points, crafting a persona of a magnanimous peer, unfazed by the recent turn of events. It was all a fragile facade over a chasm of anxiety. The meeting was held in a neutral location, a vast, sterile conference room on the 50th floor of a downtown skyscraper. The view of the city was panoramic, a kingdom they were all fighting over. David arrived early, wanting to own the space. She arrived exactly on time. Amelia Sterling was not the woman who had cried in his kitchen. She entered the room flanked by two people, Ben Carter, her CTO, and a stern-looking woman who was her legal counsel. She wore a dark navy dress that was the epitome of understated power. Her movements were economical and precise. Her eyes met his across the polished table. There was no flicker of pain, no hint of nostalgia. There was just a cool, calm assessment, the way she might look at a zoning map. In that single, unnerving glance, she communicated everything. "You have no power here." "David," she said, her voice even and professional. She didn't offer a hand. "Good to see you're well." "Amelia," he replied, forcing a smile that felt like cracking plaster. "Congratulations on the bid. It was impressive." "Thank you," she said, taking her seat directly opposite him. "We saw an opportunity for innovation and we took it." The meeting began, and David watched, mesmerized, as she commanded the room. She was fluent in the languages of finance, engineering, and environmental law. She fielded complex questions with ease, deferring to her team when necessary, but always remaining the clear center of gravity. He tried to find a flaw, a chink in her armor. He attempted to challenge her on a minor logistical point, a subtle jab about the practicalities of implementing her tech on such a massive scale. "That's a valid point, David," she said, turning her full attention to him. The use of his first name felt both intimate and dismissive. "It's a challenge we anticipated 2 years ago. Ben, could you bring up the simulation model for the staging area on West 33rd? Ben Carter tapped on his laptop, and a complex 3D model appeared on the large screen, showing a hyper-efficient solution that completely neutralized David's point. It was a polite, professional, and utterly brutal shutdown. He had tried to test her, and she had revealed she was playing chess while he was still setting up the checkers board. Throughout the 2-hour meeting, she never once broke her professional composure. But David, who knew her better than anyone in that room, saw the subtle tells. The way she held her pen, the slight tensing of her jaw when he spoke. The history between them was a ghost in the room, invisible to everyone but them. He had been the sun she orbited. Now she was a distant, cold star, and he was just a speck in her gravitational field. As the meeting concluded, people began to mingle. David saw his chance. He needed to speak to her alone, to try and break through the corporate armor. "Mia," he said, approaching her as she gathered her papers, using the name he hadn't said in 5 years. She stopped, her back still to him. She took a slow breath before turning around. Her eyes were like ice. "My name is Amelia," she said quietly, her voice dangerously low. "You will address me as such in a professional setting." He stammered, feeling his carefully constructed confidence disintegrate. "I'm stunned. How you did all this. I had no idea." A small, mirthless smile touched her lips. "Of course you didn't. You never looked. You saw a housewife, a support system. You never bothered to look at the architect standing right beside you." "I'm sorry," he heard himself say, and was shocked to find that he might actually mean it. For how things ended." She looked at him, and for a fleeting second he saw a flicker of the woman he'd wounded. A flash of pain, so quick he almost missed it. But then it was gone, replaced by an impenetrable calm. "Don't be," she said, her voice softening just enough to be devastating. "You think your betrayal was the end of my story. You were wrong. It was the beginning. What you did to me was cruel, but it was also a gift. You set me free. You showed me exactly what I was worth when I was attached to you, which was nothing, so I decided to find out what I was worth on my own." She slid her tablet into her briefcase and snapped it shut. The sound echoed in the cavernous room. "Now, if you'll excuse me," she said, her professional mask firmly back in place, "I have an empire to run." She walked away without a backward glance, leaving David standing alone in the glass conference room, feeling smaller and more transparent than he ever had in his life. The defeat at the Hudson Yards meeting was a psychological blow, but the business repercussions were far more tangible. David's world, once a fortress of steel and concrete, began to unravel thread by thread. The Aura partnership wasn't just a one-off deal, it was a paradigm shift. Other developers, seeing the immense financial and PR benefits, started flocking to Aura's platform. Miller Development's project pipeline began to dry up. Banks that had once eagerly extended him credit were now demanding more rigorous sustainability reports his company was ill-equipped to produce. He was a captain of a fleet of galleons in the age of steamships. The pressure mounted, and the cracks in his new life with Chloe began to widen into fissures. The lifestyle she demanded was predicated on continuous, ostentatious success. As his business faltered, her anxiety manifested as sharp, cutting criticisms. "What do you mean we have to cut back on the Hamptons house renovation?" she demanded one evening, her voice shrill. "People will talk. They'll think we're in trouble." "We are in trouble," he'd yelled back, the frustration of the past few months boiling over. "While you've been picking out Italian marble, my company has been bleeding. This is real, Chloe." "This is her fault," Chloe spat, her face contorted with a venom that shocked him. "Your mousy little ex-wife. She's trying to destroy you. You need to fight back. Sue her. Dig up some dirt on her." David looked at her, at this woman he had upended his life for, and felt a profound sense of exhaustion. Her solution to everything was to attack, to tear down. He was beginning to realize that Amelia's strength was in her ability to build. Chloe's was only in her ability to take. Desperate, Chloe decided to take matters into her own hands. Without telling David, she arranged to, accidentally, run into Amelia at a coffee shop near Aura's headquarters. It was a disaster. Amelia, holding a latte and talking on the phone, simply looked up, registered Chloe's presence with a flicker of disinterest, and said into the phone, "Sorry, Ben, I have to deal with a minor, irrelevant distraction. I'll call you back." She ended the call and looked at Chloe. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone the same one you might use for a pushy salesperson. "I think we should talk," Chloe began, trying to project an air of confidence. "I don't," Amelia replied, taking a sip of her coffee. "We have nothing to discuss. My business is with David's company, not with his personal arrangements." The dismissal was so absolute, so complete, that it left Chloe speechless. She had expected a catfight, tears, a dramatic confrontation. Instead, she had been swatted away like a gnat. She returned to the penthouse fuming, her sense of humiliation palpable. The incident only served to further poison her relationship with David. Meanwhile, David was forced into a position he had never known: humility. He was losing. Badly. His attempts to compete by slashing prices only made him look desperate. His legacy was crumbling. One night, alone in his office after another brutal day of investor calls, he found himself thinking not about the business, but about Mia. He remembered a time, early in their marriage, when his first solo project had nearly gone bankrupt. He'd come home, defeated, and she had stayed up with him all night, brainstorming solutions, making coffee, and refusing to let him give up. She had been his partner in every sense of the word. He picked up the phone and called her personal assistant, requesting a private meeting. He didn't know what he was going to say. Apologize? Beg? He just knew he had to talk to the architect, not the CEO. To his surprise, she agreed. They met at a quiet, empty bar in a hotel downtown. She arrived looking tired, the weight of her own responsibilities showing in the faint lines around her eyes. For a moment, she looked like the Mia he remembered. "What do you want, David?" she asked, cutting straight to the point. "I wanted to apologize," he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "Properly, not in a boardroom, for everything, for what I said, for what I did. I was a fool." She looked at him, her gaze analytical, searching. "Is this apology because you're genuinely sorry, or because your company is on the verge of collapse and you think I can help you?" The question was so direct, so incisive that he couldn't lie. "I don't know," he admitted, the honesty feeling like a surrender. "Maybe both. Does it matter?" "Yes," she said softly. "It matters. One is about remorse. The other is about strategy." She leaned forward. "Let me tell you something you don't know. The day I left, I drove to a motel. I had about $7,000 to my name. I sat on the bed and I thought about ending everything. That's how fragile I was. Your words almost killed me, David." He flinched as if struck. He had never considered the depth of her despair, only the inconvenience of her presence. "But I didn't," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I decided that the best revenge wasn't to ruin you. I never cared enough to do that. The best revenge was to prove you wrong, to prove that I wasn't nothing without you. So I built. I took all that pain and anger and I used it as fuel. Aura wasn't built to destroy you. It was built to save me." She stood up, leaving her untouched drink on the table. "Your company is failing because you're a dinosaur. You didn't adapt. You didn't innovate. You got arrogant and lazy. That has nothing to do with me. That's all on you." She paused at the door. "Goodbye, David. I truly hope you find a way to start over. Everyone deserves that chance." As she walked out, David realized his folly. He had come here seeking absolution or a lifeline, still thinking this was somehow about him. But her story had moved on. He wasn't the villain in her narrative anymore. He was just the prologue. The end for Miller Development came faster than David could have imagined. A key lender, spooked by the company's declining project portfolio, called in a massive loan. The dominoes began to fall. Within a month, he was facing bankruptcy. The empire he had spent a lifetime building was about to be sold off for parts. His life with Chloe imploded. Faced with the reality of losing the penthouse, the cars, and the status she had fought so hard for, she revealed her true nature. There were no words of support, no partnership in crisis. There was only blame and a cold, transactional departure. "I didn't sign up for this," she told him, standing in the half-empty living room as movers packed her designer clothes into boxes. "I'm not going to be dragged down with you." She left. Her final act not one of passion or anger, but of simple, self-serving calculation. David was no longer a good investment. Left alone in the cavernous, silent apartment, David was forced to confront the totality of his failure. He had lost his first wife through betrayal and his second through bankruptcy. He had sacrificed genuine love for fleeting ego and ended up with neither. His lawyers told him his only option was to sell the company's assets in a bankruptcy auction. It was the ultimate humiliation. His name, his legacy, would be picked apart by his rivals. Then, a week before the auction, he received an unexpected offer. It came from a private equity firm he'd never heard of, Sterling Capital. The offer was to purchase Miller Development's entire asset portfolio, its land holdings, its existing buildings, its brand, for a price that was just enough to settle all its debts and leave David with a small but not insignificant amount of seed money to start over. It was a lifeline, a clean exit that would allow him to avoid the shame of a public auction. He knew immediately who was behind it. His lawyer arranged the final meeting. It was in the same building as their last meeting, but this time in a smaller, more private office. Amelia was there alone, dressed in simple slacks and a blouse. There were no lawyers, no entourage. "Why?" David asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Why do this? You could have let me be torn apart at the auction. You could have bought my best assets for pennies on the dollar." Amelia looked out the window at the city below. "Because that's what you would have done," she said calmly. "That's what Chloe would have done. Tearing things down is easy. It requires no vision." She turned to face him. "I'm not buying your company to punish you, David. I'm buying it for the land. You were always good at acquiring prime real estate. Your weakness was what you built on it. I'm going to use your old properties to build the future. Affordable, sustainable housing, community centers, green spaces. Your legacy of concrete and glass is going to become my legacy of life and growth." The power play was breathtaking in its scope and its mercy. She wasn't just defeating him, she was transforming his failures into her success. She was not seeking revenge, she was seeking redemption, not for him, but for the very ground he had built upon. "The offer is fair," she continued, her tone all business now. "It clears your name, settles your debts, and gives you a chance to walk away with some dignity. What you do next is up to you." He was speechless. The woman he had called fragile was offering him a grace he had never offered her and a lesson he would never forget. He had measured his life in square footage and profit margins. She was measuring hers in impact and innovation. "I accept," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He signed the papers, the act of his pen dissolving his entire life's work. As he slid the documents across the table, he felt not the sting of defeat, but the strange, clean slate feeling of release. The weight of his own arrogance was finally lifted. "Thank you, Mia," he said, the name slipping out instinctively, but this time it felt different. It was a name spoken with a respect he had never truly had before. She gave a small, sad smile. "My name is Amelia," she corrected him gently. "Mia was a long time ago. That woman is gone." She was right. The woman he had destroyed was gone. But the woman who had risen from her ashes was now, in the most unexpected way, offering him the chance to do the same. A year later, the New York skyline was changing. On the site of what was once destined to be another monolithic Miller Tower, a new kind of structure was rising. It was a marvel of green architecture, covered in vertical gardens and solar panels, a living, breathing building that was the flagship of Aura's new development arm. Amelia Sterling stood on a nearby rooftop with Ben Carter, looking at the project. They were partners in every sense of the word now, their friendship and professional respect having deepened into a quiet, steady love built not on power dynamics, but on shared vision. "It's beautiful," Ben said, putting his arm around her. "It's a start," she replied, a genuine smile on her face. Her life was no longer defined by the past. The pain was still a part of her story, a scar she would always carry, but it was no longer an open wound. It was a reminder of the strength she hadn't known she possessed. Her wealth and power were not the rewards. They were tools. The reward was this: the act of creation, of building something meaningful and lasting. She rarely thought of David. From what she'd heard through the grapevine, he had moved to the Midwest, using the money from the sale to start a small consulting firm, helping small towns with responsible urban planning. He was living a smaller, quieter life. She hoped he had found some measure of peace. Her final act toward him hadn't been about forgiveness. She wasn't sure she could ever truly forgive the cruelty. but about closing a chapter on her own terms. She had refused to let his bitterness define the end of their story. As she stood there, watching the sun set behind her new building, she thought about the woman in the Vermont cabin, sketching out her dreams in a fit of despair. She had thought she was designing buildings. She now knew she had been drawing a blueprint for her own soul. She had lost a husband and a life she thought she wanted. But in the silence and the wreckage, she had found something far more valuable. Herself. Not the wife, not the victim, not the CEO, but Amelia, the architect, the builder, the survivor. And for the first time in a very, very long time, she felt truly, unshakably whole. And that's how Amelia Sterling didn't just rebuild her life. She redesigned the entire world around her. Her story isn't just about the satisfaction of revenge, it's about the profound power of self-worth. It shows that sometimes the most devastating betrayals can become the catalysts for our greatest transformations. What David saw as an ending was, for her, a groundbreaking ceremony for a new and better life. What did you think of Amelia's journey? Do you believe her final act toward David was one of mercy or the ultimate power move? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story. Thank you for watching.